Alright folks, I have a particularly spooky tale for you today about two very sinister games that are so scary that you might just get your shivers timbered. But before I get on to our spooktaculous tale for today's video, I first need to cover some things, like what is a baby horror game, and what makes a horror game. But hold up. First, a shameless plug. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop the spooky voice and say that if you do enjoy this video going forward, please make sure to hit that big ol' subscribe button, because we're aiming for a total of 500 subs by the end of the year. And by the time this video is out, we only have 2 months to go, people, so sign your soul away to me, because wouldn't that be funny? But that's the end of my shameless plug, so let's jump right on into this by first talking about what makes a horror game. And if I'm being honest, that is pretty hard to define because horror is probably one of the most varied genres out there, I think. But there is one thing that a horror game definitely has to do: be scary. And it's completely fine if a game attempts to be scary and fails. However, the two games I'll be talking about are slightly different, and for that, I have given them the title of baby horror games, which is a term that I made up myself, and will be trademarking the second this video comes out. But what does it mean? Well, a baby horror game is a type of game that would be considered horror despite its attributes that would only really be enjoyable to a child. And as said before, I have two games that I want to discuss, both of which being baby horror games, which you now know the meaning of. So let's talk about our first inmate in the prison of mid-games, Poppy's Playtime. A game so good that it now has dozens of different shops around the world selling its popular villain Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy as plush toys, which I would say is a bit strange because a horror villain is supposed to be scary, not something that can easily be made into merchandise and then sold to children. Horror villains or monsters are supposed to be scary, and you can tell the difference between a good one and Huggy Wuggy. So I'm going to discuss an example of a good horror monster, which in my opinion is the overgrown fetus from Resident Evil Village. Because one, it isn't made up of super bright colours that attract to the attention deficit brain of a 4-year-old, and instead it's made up of quite dead and bloody colours, with an introduction so good that it makes me piss myself anytime I play through this section of the game. But what does Huggy Wuggy bring to the table? Because the funny fetus creature had a chilling, drawn-out introduction where you have all of your weapons taken away from you and you're forced to listen to its piercing screams down the dark and empty corridors of the basement. But Huggy Wuggy just appear and jump scare you while being chased through the vents. Which, yeah, it's scary. After all, if it wasn't scary, then why would so many YouTubers be practically screaming their asses off whilst playing through the vent section? And there's a simple answer: jump scares. Jump scares are an easy way of creating fear, as we as humans just genuinely do not react well to loud and fast-moving things. So constantly throwing them at us is gonna do the job at shivering our timbers. But after that fear wears off, we go back to seeing Huggy Wuggy as the lovable mascot he is, because without the sharp teeth and the bloodlust, he isn't really that scary. In fact, he looks quite cute, something that a child would like to play with, certainly not a bloody monster. But hey, if I'm going to call out this game for being nothing more than a shameless cash grab, then I would talk about the law-unlocking NFTs that MatPat definitely bought. But I'm not going to do that because I primarily want to talk about the game itself, which has some good ideas and some actually pretty gruesome imagery, yet it fails to be any more than a baby horror game, but one that could have been a lot better if they had changed some designs, because outside of its colourful characters, it does a pretty decent job at being scary. So if, for example, Huggy Wuggy got a much darker design which highlights just how long he's been alone for, that would work so much better, not only being a greater design, but also it can tell a bit more of a story through its design. So in conclusion, Poppy's Playtime could have been very good, and I really wanted it to be good when it first came out, but it just seems like it's gonna be overall pretty mediocre. Although when it comes to the next game I want to discuss, I think calling it mediocre would be a slight understatement, because it's bad, and I mean bad. And also, it may be a tad bit difficult to purely focus on the game when talking about our next game, because our next game is Garten of Banban, or should I say Garten of Peak Peak, which is a game that I don't believe was made for any other purpose than a cash grab. as this game is practically full to the brim with shit like bright colours, Marvel tier dialogue, and a whole lot of other people's assets that looks like something a novice at game developing would make, but the two who made it, the Euphoric brothers, aren't. In fact, one of them even made a very dodgy game that was maybe just a way for him to live out a very sick fantasy, but I'm not going to get into that and just move on to actually talking about the game itself, which is just weird from start to finish, with the first chapter in particular being so not scary that it actually becomes funny. So to start with, we have the funny bird, who just stares at you from down the corridor and then slowly disappears, and there's 3 problems with that, which are all highlighted by a very talented YouTuber, Unique Geese, who remade the first chapter of the game that solves this bird problem, as it first redesigns the bright funny bird into a hollow-looking nightmare creature, and then removes all light from the corridor, giving the player a flashlight instead, which forces them to venture into the darkness. And then finally, the bird moves much faster in the remake when it stops looking at you, which is much more intense than the slow-moving one from the original. So overall, it wouldn't have been impossible to make this game scary. In fact, it would have been pretty easy, but the thing is, the Euphoric brothers don't want it to be scary, because if they were to have a scary game, that would lose them their young audience. But hey, I don't really have any way of confirming that. For all I know, they could really have been trying to make a scary game, but when you do stuff like link a pre-made merch page on the first chapter of your game, stocked with only the finest of Redbubble merchandise, it's hard to see it any other way than just a cash grab. And before moving on from Garden of Peak, I'm not going to talk about the later chapters because I just haven't played them, and I really don't want to, because if I do play them, I have to use the drone again, which is one of the worst and janky game mechanics I have ever witnessed in my lifetime. But I also don't think it's very fair for me to judge the later chapters of the game, because hell, maybe they're better. I doubt it, but they might be. However, that aside, I'm going to go ahead and move on from Garden of Peak and point out the thing that these two games have in common, which is the fact that they're both a part of the mascot horror genre. Now, the difference between what I call baby horror games and mascot horror games is that mascot horror games are first an official thing, and not a made-up term by yours truly, but also the fact that mascot horror does have good games. I mean, just because we've had some dog shit games recently, can we really discredit all games that are a part of this genre? No, because some of them are actually fantastic. For example, the original Five Nights at Freddy's game, which may not be as scary now as it was back then, but even so, it was scary because it used game mechanics that I don't think had been used before, and also it was just straight up terrifying. As unlike the two games I've mentioned in this video that have bright coloured and sometimes fluffy mascots as their monsters for the game, FNAF does not, having every animatronic in the first game follow one colour palette, which is sort of similar to how Garden of Peak and Poppy's Playtime designed their monsters, but unlike them, FNAF makes each of the animatronics featured in the game very dirty, which makes the colour palette look more dead, and in the case of Foxy, he's already missing a good bit of his costume. Although the point I'm really trying to make here by rambling on about how good the original FNAF was, is the fact that just because we've had some bad mascot horror recently, doesn't mean it's a bad genre. And I suppose you could make the point that though it was good at one point, it's kind of dying now, but we still have some good stuff coming out, like the new Ruin DLC for Security Breach. So overall, mascot horror isn't dead, and it isn't dying either, so that's why I came up with the term baby horror, which isolates a certain group of games and puts them all together in one made-up genre, that you can say is stupid if you want, because I did just make up the term, to be fair, but hey, what are you gonna do, sue me? It's almost the end of the video, and you can't sue me if you've watched the whole video, because that's, as the youngsters say, cringe. But moving on, because that is the end now, and to be honest, I don't really know where I was going with that part. I've just been writing this final part of the script for a while now, and I just needed a way to conclude everything, okay? But before I go, I do want to say a few quick things. Firstly being that if you did watch this video and think, wait, I like those games. Is he calling me a baby? Then I'm sorry, because I had no intention of poking fun at you or what you enjoy, just the games. And if you did enjoy this video, please make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment down below, and hit that enormous red subscribe button, because I am aiming for 500 subs by the end of the year, and any help in getting there would be much appreciated. However, that is all I have to say for today's video, so goodbye and happy Halloween to all of you lovely, lovely people.